Hello everyone, welcome back to Gustav Coding. In the previous videos, we got our hands dirty with Spring Boot, creating our first controller and learning how to build RESTful APIs. If you missed those, make sure to catch up, link in the description below. In this chapter, we are diving deeper into the world of Spring Boot by exploring how to work with data. We will introduce you to Spring Data JPA, create JPA entities to model our data, and implement JPA repositories for database interaction. By the end of this chapter, you will be well on your way to building data-driven applications with Spring Boot. So let's get started. To work with data in Spring Boot, you will leverage a fantastic tool called Spring Data JPA. But what exactly is it? Spring Data JPA is a part of the larger Spring Data project, and it simplifies data access and persistence in a Spring application. Imagine you want to interact with a database in your Java application. You'd usually need to write tons of boiler code, right? Spring Data JPA streamlines that process, allowing you to focus on your application's logic rather than wrestling with database queries. So what then is the role of Spring Data JPA? It provides an abstraction layer over JPA, making it easier to work with databases. JPA stands for Jakarta Persistence API, but was formerly called Java Persistence API. Now, with Spring Data JPA, we can create repositories and write queries without getting bogged down in database-specific details. Now, let's dive in and see how Spring Data JPA can make our lives easier. First things first, we need to add a dependency for Spring Data JPA. So, in our form.xml file, we type dependency, then the artifact ID as spring-boot-starter-data-jpa, and the group ID as org.springframework.boot. Nice and easy, don't you think? The first step in working with data is to create JPA entities to model our data. JPA entities are Java classes that represent the structure of the data you want to store in your database. Let's say we want to create an entity for a basic book that has an ID, title, author, and a price. So we'll create a Java class. Then we name it book. Now let's annotate it with @entity. This tells Spring Boot that the book class is an entity. Now inside our entity class, we will define the fields for ID, title, author, and then price. So we have a private long ID, private string title, private string author, private double price. Now let's have IntelliJ generate our constructors, getters and setters, and toString method for us. We will generate 3 constructors. First off, a no args constructor, then another with all parameters except the ID, and the last one, an all args constructor. Now let's generate our getters and setters. Then finally, our toString method. We will also use annotations like @id, @sequence generator, and @generated value to specify the primary key. To do that, on the line before the ID field, we type @id, next at sequence generator, and then we pass in the parameters. Name equals book sequence. Then sequence name equals book sequence. And allocation size equals 1. Then next, at generated value, also with parameters, strategy equals generation type dot sequence. Then our generator will equal to a sequence name, which is book sequence. And that's it. We've created our first JPA entity. Creating entities in Spring Data JPA is as straightforward as defining your Java classes. Okay, now that we have everything set up, let's run the application and see if it works. Okay, so we have an error. Now let's examine our error to see why it occurred. So our error reads, application failed to start. Description, failed to configure a data source. URL attribute is not specified, and no embedded data source could be configured. Reason, failed to determine a suitable driver class. So what this means is we haven't configured our Spring Boot project to connect to a data source, that is a database. And also we are missing a suitable driver class. To fix this error, we need to create our database and write some configurations. Now let's create our database to link our entity class. So I have logged into MySQL. To create the database, type create database bookdb. That will be the name of our database. Enter. To see if our database was created, type show databases. And as you can see, we have successfully created our database. Now back to IntelliJ. Let's open the application.properties file and let's configure our data source. So we type the following: spring.datasource.url equal to jdbc colon mysql colon // localhost colon 3306 / bookdb. Then spring.datasource.username equals root. Then spring.datasource.password. Put in the password of your database. Then spring.jpa.hibernate.ddl-auto equals create. Spring.jpa.show-sql equals true. Then spring.jpa.properties.hibernate.dialect equals org.hibernate.dialect.mysql dialect. Then spring.jpa.properties.hibernate.format SQL equals true. I think we have everything we need. No, sorry. One more thing. We need to add the dependency for the MySQL driver. So in the pom.xml, let's add the following dependency. So like we did with the previous dependency, the artifact ID will be mysql-connector-j. Then the group ID will be com.mysql. Then we need to add a scope. So we type scope and then we give it the value runtime. Now let's try to run the application and see if it works. So as you can see, the application worked and you can see some query statements written. Now let's see how we can interact with this entity using JPA repositories. To interact with our JPA entity, we will need to create a repository. In Spring Data JPA, a repository is an interface that extends the JPA repository interface. It's like a magic box that provides you with all the CRUD operations you need for your entity. That is the create, read, update, and delete operations. Let's create a repository for our book entity. We'll create a new interface. Then we name it book repository. Now we have our interface created. And now let's extend the JPA repository. JPA repository takes the entity class and the data type of the ID field. So book and then long. Now, by extending JPA repository, we get all the basic CRUD operations like save, find by ID, find all, and delete. Now, in our service or controller, we can simply inject our book repository and use these methods to interact with our database. It's like having a powerful database access layer without writing much code. Spring Data JPA does most of the heavy lifting for you. So, in this section, we've introduced you to Spring Data JPA, shown you how to create JPA entities, and implemented JPA repositories for database interaction. You are now equipped to start working with the data in your Spring Boot applications. If you found this information helpful, give us a thumbs up. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to drop them below. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter of this Spring Boot tutorial series, where we will dive even deeper into building powerful data-driven applications. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.